So good afternoon for some of you and a hearty good evening to many of the others. I know it's been a long day and I'm appreciative that you all are willing to come over to my session of all things right at the last time. So I'm super excited to be a part of Map Camp this year because I've been doing Wardley mapping for about 5 or 6 years and have always wanted to be able to attend Map Camp, but it was really hard to find time to make that journey across the pond to Europe to be able to be a part of that. But that's all changed this year, like, hasn't it, just a little bit? This COVID-19 thing has not only been a horrifying disaster of epic proportions, especially here in the US, it has completely wreaked havoc across industries. So over the past several months, I've actually been working on a research project with CMOs and executives and CEOs of some of the largest financial institutions in the world, and found that in these interviews, universally, their processes, their strategies, their tactics have all been turned upside down. But COVID isn't the only disruption we'll face in our businesses. We have to train on methods to visualize, to evaluate, to respond to these disruptions, combining situational awareness with doctrine, with gameplay, with execution. So what I want to show is how this framework and approach, based on Simon's work, helped save several of my clients from large existential external threats, and in some cases, internal threats. Though, of course, the names and the industries I'll be using are changed to kind of protect the guilty, obviously, to be part of this. So I want to set the stage here with a real-life example with rapid real-life consequences to show how all this works together. So in addition to my strategy and consulting work, I've spent over 20 years as a fire chief, as a medic, as a technical rescuer. And what you're seeing on your screen right now is a picture of a call we were on just about 2 weeks ago. A tree trimmer was cutting a tree. He was up in a bucket lift cutting a tree, and the tree fell on him and it trapped him in the bucket lift. And you can actually see the tree on the lift right there inside that circle. Now, when we get called out, the first thing we need is situational awareness. We need to be able to see the scene, and not visible in this picture is that the tree trapped the worker, but also brought power lines down on top of them. So as a commander, we have an unstable tree, we have power lines down, and we have a trapped worker. And we need to move this worker from an unstable state into a more stable state. So given this is a Wordley mapping conference, we can actually map this. Maybe we can map it. See what happens here. Try again. There it is. All right. So we can map this. And when we map this, what we can see on the left-hand side here, so if I do the axis instead of Genesis to utility, another way of kind of thinking about that axis is stability. Because as we get into more productized utility components, they tend to ideally be more stable. So if I map this situation in a stability axis, we can start with, we have a lot of things that are unstable here. The trapped worker, we've got the tree limb, we've got the power lines, and we even have electricity because the power lines are naturally carrying electricity. So if we want to move this worker to a stable state, we're going to have to map the dependencies to get there. So to actually see that, and I don't know why, let's see if we just do it like this. Yeah, okay. So we'll do it in a little window here and see if that works better. So to actually get the trapped worker out of here, we're going to need to stabilize a couple of dependencies. So the worker's trapped by that tree limb and the power line. To stabilize that tree limb, we need some sort of a gameplay for doing that. In this case, a rope system. And more importantly, we need to stabilize the power line, which primarily means stabilizing the electricity, since without power, power lines are just wires. And then with all of those things stabilized, we can achieve our goal and get the worker out of there. So summarizing, what we found was ourselves in a precarious position and immediately worked to gain situational awareness. We then pulled from our doctrine, life safety and stabilization, to formulate a set of potential game plays. We then executed on those game plays, constantly refreshing our awareness. Now, the outcome here was great. Once the power company cut power to the line, we were able to get the worker out without having to even stabilize the tree, because it turns out that it resting against the lift was stable enough. And rather than have to set up an entire rope system to extract the worker, that same power company truck just took his bucket lift, moved it over to the worker, who we then moved into the bucket and lowered to the ground, unharmed, but as you can imagine, ready to take the rest of the day off. I'll pause here for 1 second. Yes, I'll put the presentation up as a PDF, and this presentation is also being recorded, so you'll be able to access this on the Map Camp YouTube channel as well. So stepping back to this, as you have no doubt heard throughout the day, this looping situation, good gracious, it does not like this at all. This looping action is popularized most in John Boyd's OODA loop. We observed a trapped worker, oriented ourselves to the situation, decided on our game plays, and then acted, which started the loop over again. We didn't immediately jump into trying to lead the scene without understanding the inputs from landscape and context, as well as our own doctrine. But when we find ourselves in trouble, Mother Mary comes to, no, I'm sorry, that's a Beatles reference, ignore that. When we find ourselves in trouble, we want to start to immediately do things. And for most of us and a lot of organizations, that's our MO. Like, we want to have that bias for action. We want to start doing things. So I want to step out of technical rescue for a second and look at how we can apply this framework and thinking to our businesses by saying hello to Medco. Now, I want to say that Medco, for the purposes of this presentation, is not a real company. What I found out from doing this similar talk with some of these same elements is that Medco is a real company somewhere in the world. So I'll make it clear that, one, I'm not talking about them, and two, finding medical sounding short name companies is hard. So forgive that kind of thing. But so what we can look at with Medco is that they have been around a long time, and they have evolved their business model. And, well, there we go. Okay. They are experts in being able to take medical and chart data written by physicians and other medical personnel, scanning it with custom algorithms, and notifying them of potential anomalies, from billing to coding errors to potential misdiagnoses. They integrate with several platforms, but the biggest partner they work with is Amazon, who has their own product for securely storing chart data. And why wouldn't they have them as a partner? Amazon makes it clear that together we can accomplish anything. With EC2 and with S3 and with a host of other services and Lambda, together you can come and you can build anything. But then one day, Cynthia, the CTO of Medco, is watching the Amazon re:Event conference and suddenly finds herself face to face with Kathy Bates in the movie Misery, wielding a sledgehammer called Amazon Comprehend Medical, specifically designed to extract information from unstructured medical text. In addition, Cynthia can read between the lines and see that moving this into Amazon's AI space is clearly the next move. And with that kind of compute power and resources, Medco could be in real trouble. Because what Amazon does is it creates APIs that people leverage. And as those services and applications mature that people build on top of, Amazon can see it coming. And when those services and when those applications, they get close enough to Amazon's tower of critical services, Amazon expands their moat to incorporate those threats, often for free, because it drives more use of their core tower services. It's a devastating strategy, especially when you've innovated something that Amazon suddenly leverages and commoditizes. So that night, Cynthia set up a call with me. she shares what she saw in re:Event, along with some additional information that she's gathered since then. It's clear that one of their biggest partners is, unsurprisingly, moving into their space. So is this the end of Medco? Yes, it was. Thanks for taking out time to come to the talk. I hope you enjoy the rest of the No. I'm only kidding. Everyone knows that when you see a question in a headline, the answer is always no, and this is no different. But for Medco to survive, and not just survive, but survive and thrive, was going to require some significant shifts, which means that we needed to go back to our principles. Gain situational awareness, understand our climate and our doctrine, decide on game plays, and then execute them, looping back to stay aware. So we get mapping. And the first place that we want to start is, what are the moral imperatives for Medco? And what are the key user needs that drive Medco services and the things that they do? So for each one of those services and each one of those user needs, we create a value chain for each of them. And then from this value chain, we're able to map where those components end up at along the maturation lifecycle. This should look all pretty straightforward based on a whole day's worth of conference in front of you. And then once we have this sense of where it's at along the map, we can look at where their game plays are. So in this case, Outcome Analyzer is a critical part of their business, driving the advice that they report back to their customers. And when we think about moving a market, what we want to look for are opportunities to mature components. And a productized Outcome Analyzer would be a killer play in their market, one that is already pretty key to their business. Unfortunately, when we overlay what the landscape looks like from this new perspective of Amazon, what they're commoditizing, we can see it's the exact spot that is the highest growth area for Medco. And Medco, they don't want to compete head on with Amazon. They're going to need something else. So we have some situational awareness. We're kind of armed with that. And we want to bring in two other sources of information before we really start talking about gameplays. So the first is Wordley's Doctrine. So Simon was talking about this this morning, which are universally useful patterns applicable regardless of context. And this doctrine tells us Cynthia is going to have several things she needs to lead her organization in, including systematic methods of learning, knowing their users, focusing on user needs, and moving fast. But another doctrine applicable here, Medco has been around a while, and it's used to operating in a more productized, utilitized environment where maybe more Six Sigma methods or sequential waterfall type methods, or maybe even just like we're doing Scrum, but it's just the same thing. It's just a cycle. That's what they're used to probably using. But if what they're going to do now, if their market is shifting and they're going to have to do rapid discovery and they're going to have to do lean product development as they explore this market, that's going to change the methods the teams need to use. And that change is going to require change management, it's going to require training, and it's going to require support. So that's our doctrine. And the other baseline that we want to bring forward is Wardley's climatic patterns. So these are the rules of the game. And let's see if it goes forward now. There it was. Go back. There they are. So these are the rules of the game. Success breeds inertia and competitors' actions will change the game. That's pretty hurtful to hear, right? But it's true. That's what's happening here. But then we can look up above that and we see that efficiency enables innovation and higher order systems create new sources of value. And those are really interesting. Those are really fascinating because when we innovate and we build components, those components will, if they're successful, become commoditized over time, becoming more product-like. We've probably seen things we've built in-house that need more support and need more change management over time as more people rely on it. But that commoditization, that productizing, that utilization of components, that's what's going to lead to new sources of value because new things are going to start to get built off of those components. And an interesting exercise that I've done with organizations and you can do with Wardley Maps is to make future state bets about which components will evolve. And once productized, what components could be built on top of those. Now, those kinds of innovative bets are risky, right? Because now we're operating from what could the potential hold and how could these kinds of things mature and where could we push the markets at. But that can also lead to the discovery and being able to be the market leader of new markets that haven't even fully emerged. So at this point, we've got some situational awareness. We've got an understanding of doctrine and climatic patterns, and we can start looking at game plays. And Simon talked about there are a lot of game plays that you can pull in. And one of the things that differs game plays from doctrine and climatic patterns is that they're context specific. Threat acquisition is a terrible strategy if you don't have any threats, as an example. But others can be relevant in the context, but bad choices. For example, and we actually talked about these for Medco's kind of game plays, was could we use fear, uncertainty, and doubt to delay Amazon's rollout? And then maybe start talking to Congress and use defensive regulation to capitalize on them being a monopoly to reduce their competitiveness. Those are game plays, right? For sure. I find that typically those are plays that you take whenever you don't have a great product or strategy and you want to just delay things long enough to pump up the company, sell it, and then float away at a golden parachute. But they're there, and they're things to be aware of because your competitors could also try some of these move on you. Now, once we kind of went through this, Cynthia and I determined that there were probably 20 potential game plays that were applicable in this context. So walking through some of these, network effects was the first one. Medco had recently introduced APIs that medical offices could use to define common ways of searching for concerns to catch things Medco didn't have in their algorithms. This was catching on, and other providers were starting to build components leveraging this capability and sharing them. So building on that network drives out broader awareness and capability. That has a dual effect. So one is that it drives more people to use Medco, but it also, interestingly, expands Medco's capabilities for free. Medco isn't investing the capital to figure those things out. Medco's customers are, and Medco is able to just take advantage of that. So it's a very powerful thing. The next one that we can look at is limitations and differentiation. So even in a company the size of Amazon, and sometimes, especially because it's a company their size, there will be limitations and ways of differentiating for their competitor. So these types of game plays exploit and highlight these limitations. Though, as we saw a couple slides ago with Innovate, Leverage, Commoditize, exploiting limitations, exploiting differentiation is really a form of leveraging innovation, and a larger player can copy and commoditize that, right? Like it's not always about who's first in the market. Sometimes it's about who's best in the market, as we can see with the iPod and Zune. Zune, that was what it was called. So that's something to be aware of. Another gameplay is center of gravity. And I find this to be really important. And it was a fascinating thing for Medco in this example, because what we're looking at here is Medco obviously has a great base of customers. And finding out why those customers chose Medco and stick with them helps us find the center of that support. And whenever we talked about this when I talked about this with their executive team, they could not answer the question of why customers used them. And I found that so fascinating to me that here's a company that's been around a long time, that has a lot of growth, is well loved, and they can't specifically say why it is customers use their product. So worth pulling into there. So two more strategies to look at. One is embrace and extend. So of course, rather than competing on a specific offering, maybe there's a way of just saying, that looks awesome. We're going to incorporate it and we're going to extend our capabilities because of it. So as the comedian George Carlin, those of you familiar with him, once said, if it's true that plastic is not degradable, well, the planet will simply incorporate plastic into a new paradigm, the earth plus plastic. after he notes the Earth gets rid of us. So let's not try to get to that point of what that new paradigm looks like. The last play here is standards play. And this is another interesting one because what we're doing is defining the standards for early stage components. And we're getting those standards adopted throughout the industry, allowing us to set the direction of where they go, as well as kind of be seen as a leader in that space and being able to innovate on as part of that. So we have a lot of potential gameplays that fit into our context and fit into the culture of who we are, and we have the doctrine and capabilities of being able to execute on. So one of the things we can start to really do as we're looking at these gameplays is mapping the landscape of what each play looks like. So as an example, we can take this embrace and extend strategy and say, okay, Amazon is now providing artificial intelligence, machine learning, basically as a service. So can we embrace that and then move forward with our notion of providing augmented advice by building on top of whatever it is that Amazon is kind of producing? There's always the danger whenever you do something like this that you're now a feature of another product that can just suddenly be commoditized. But there are ways that we can map this out to look at, well, where are the dangers of that? Where are the risks? How can we keep that from happening? Another element that we could look at is by taking a look at the market differently. And instead of saying, okay, we're going to bet our farm basically on outcome analyzers, what other components do we have experience in and space in that has movement in front of it? So here we may be moving into the home market, and we could set up APIs for people to securely interact with smart speakers as a way of collecting additional information or talking about diagnoses or health questions or those kinds of things, since we're kind of in those spaces. But what's nice about all of this is that when we create these maps, there was a session earlier where I forget who it was who said, like, the first rule of mapping is not to talk about maps. And that's the case here, right? What we're doing with these maps is having conversations about movement rather than pure storytelling. Jay Bloom once told me the person telling the story controls what's in the story. And, Simon definitely talks about the notion of when you challenge a story, you're challenging the personal narrative of the person telling the story. And so what we've got with maps is a way of being able to talk about the maps instead of the story. So for example, what is our center of gravity? Why do users love us? And how would that change in a differentiation play? Or if our identity is built around outcome analysis and augmented advice, can we really afford to cede that to Amazon? Or if we look closer, maybe Amazon is primarily going to focus on simple cases, and we can integrate that simple case into what we're doing and allow us to focus on more esoteric issues that we haven't been able to train our models on. And underlying all of this, as you can kind of see on that bottom right, the market has changed, and so we need to change. The market has become disruptive, right? We're going to have to do a lot of exploration, and that means that we're going to have to operate with a high level of agility and discovery. And we're going to have to think through the impact of that, not just to our teams, to our compensation models, to our hiring models, to our skilling programs, right? Like all of those kinds of things are going to potentially be changed as we're moving forward with what this looks like. So these maps have now allowed us to explore many options with potential consequences and outcomes, or another term I like to use are hypotheses. And so as Cynthia and I were working through this, the word was getting out, and she and her leaders were getting a lot of questions from the staff along the lines of, what's our strategy? Amazon's coming for us. What are we going to do? What's our strategy? But the thing is, most of those people aren't looking to really understand strategy and maps, right? Like they don't want this picture. What they're looking for are tactics. And so as leaders, as product leaders, as business leaders, as technology leaders, we have to be able to take these and simplify them, clarify them, and inspire them, but keep those key aspects of observation and of analysis. Now, I want to reiterate a point I made before because it's really important to understand. Tactics are gameplays, and gameplays are context dependent. And that means we need to not just already understand, so that means we need to already understand doctrine and climatic principles, and not just us as leaders. We need it to be operational by our whole team so they know how to operate. And in fire rescue, we have a hierarchy of principles on a scene. So first and foremost, it's personal safety, me and my team. If we get injured, everything is much worse, and not just because I'm injured, right? Like now we have to send personnel to deal with that. It's going to delay the patient. It's all of those kinds of things. The second is life safety. So that tree trimmer, or the people in a house or in a car accident are trapped by a flood. And then finally, it's property safety. We'll absolutely hold off on putting a fire out in order to pull someone out of the house first. Obviously, right? Obviously. So looking at this picture that you've got kind of in front of you, we have an active fire, which by all appearances is in the attic. And the attic is a dangerous situation because it doesn't have the same kind of walls that you have in the rest of your house. It can just spread rapidly throughout the whole house. But we can see that the house itself is stable enough for us to enter it. And you can see the firefighter going in through the garage there. And this allows those teams to start searching for people who might be upstairs or elsewhere in the house. And once that house is clear, now the teams can start to try extinguishing the fire, saving the house if we can, allowing it to burn, called an exterior attack, or surround and drown if we can't. And we also know that fires can spread, so we'll protect the neighbors' houses by spraying water on them as time allows. But the point of this is, when I'm on scene, our entire unit knows these three key fundamentals. And tactics that I give in support of scene operations gets filtered through this doctrine. If I say, go take a hose to the second floor and extinguish the fire in the back bedroom, they're going to do that. But if they come across someone while doing that, they know that they just got a new mission without me having to tell them. So going back to our trapped tree trimmer, as the commander on scene, there is a lot in my head, but I can but I can distill it to my team by evaluating the options and playing out the hypotheses. The most critical is cutting the power so we can approach, because that's our personal safety. Even with a person trapped there, if we go and we get electrocuted, that's bad. So we have to cut the power before we do anything. The second is stabilizing the worker. So that's life safety. Then we can secure unstable elements, making that scene safer, and then we can lower the worker. But these elements, these hypotheses of the steps that we need to take are communicated with a shared understanding of doctrine and principles, so my teams know what the ultimate goal is. That's why once we cut power, my team was able to look at the tree, make a call that it was stable as it was, without us having to build out ropes and do everything else, and go straight to lowering the worker. They didn't need to come back and filter that through me. They knew what the principles were, they knew what the end goal was, and they could work through that. So going back to Medco, what are the options that we can distill out from our strategy there? And in a large organization, it's not usually as clear as we have somebody we're trying to save, right? We typically have multiple goals that we're working towards. So things get a little more complex. We have a portfolio of work that we're trying to deal with. We have lots of in-flight stuff we're dealing with. But Cynthia, the executive team, and I were able to distill that response strategy based on the gameplays, based on the doctrine, based on our context and what we knew we had, to the following key points. One was directly respond to Amazon. So we looked here at gameplays like education, differentiation, and fast followers. Make sure that our customers understand our value proposition. Ensure that we can clearly state our differentiation. But also, we need to analyze Amazon's offerings to watch for features we need to be at parity with so we don't fall behind. 2, expand the market to become more independent from Amazon. So the game plays here includes sapping, first mover, and directed investment. We're looking at ways of collecting data independent of this Amazon system. So are there other tools that we should now be trying to convince people to use, and we should be making sure we've got really good integration with? As well as what are our alternative component evolutions that we should be looking at to expand our market? The third, and this was probably one of the hardest ones for them, was innovating towards the future with rapid innovation teams. So here we're looking at gameplays like sensing engines, weak signals and horizons, and land grabs, as well as embrace and extending. We need 2 or 3 teams maybe operating solely in that genus space. And they're mapping and they're looking at where these components are going. And they're saying, or as Ben said, commando teams, sure. We're looking at where we can make future state bets. Where is the market potentially going? What insight can we get from thinking about component evolution and how we can build on top of that? And those are going to have to be small, rapid teams. It's going to be a very different way of operating, but we need those teams thinking future about where the market could go. As well as we need some of our teams embracing and extending Amazon's AI ML as a service, because we're not going to beat Amazon. So we definitely are going to need to find a way to work with that. Yes, and the pioneers, that is right. So we think about Simon's pioneer settler town planner model. A lot of times in these larger organizations, you have people operating mostly in the town planner model. And now that shift back to settlers or to pioneers is a huge organizational shift for the people that are there, for the way that they are metriced, for the way that they are rewarded, the way that the organization sees them. Lots of things that are very interesting as part of that. So, and so the last element that we can look at was investing in partner expansion. So the game plays here on market enablement, exploiting those network effects and open approaches. So network effects are incredibly, incredibly powerful. So we're treating those as something neat that we were doing on the side. But now we want to elevate that as a first-class effort within the organization to properly grow, support, and market the efforts of these partners to building out analyzers. So the interesting thing is this, right? Like, so this is nice. So this is our strategy, if you would. And obviously we're backing a lot of this with the doctrine, with capacity, with mapping, all those things. But even with sets of guidelines like these, organizations still need deeper ways of sequencing the work to go after the critical elements the organization needs. Now, generally, companies have tremendous amounts of in-flight work. So understanding how everything fits in can be where this all starts to fall apart. Now, I'm not going to dive into what you see on your screen very deeply into this session, since it's kind of outside the realm of Wordley Maps. But this is an example of a tool I use with business units, with business divisions, to determine the key objectives for the executive team. So the examples here are things like increasing digital transactions and filling product gaps. And then we create with that executive team specific mappings of what high means for a given element. So as an example, one of my clients, we were driving new purchase activity, and a high in new purchase activity meant 25 million or more per year in new purchase activity. And then we look at how do we weight these things? So do we care more about filling product gaps, or do we care more about percent of digital transactions? Or maybe we care about them equally. And then what we can do with that is we score each of our increments that we're on here a little bit, and we're able to create these business value scores. And then we can apply that to elements. So how urgent is it that we need to realize this? A great example to go off the rails for just 1 second is one of my clients in one of these sessions where we were doing this mapping saw an item that was like, the CEO was in there, and he had this project that he thought was like really innovative for the organization, but the product managers had put another thing in front of it. And he said, why is this thing in front of this project? And they said, well, because this is a like FCC mandate. And if we don't put this in place, then we're going to start being fined like $250,000 a month for non-compliance. And the CEO said, okay, I understand that, but you're going to spend 5 months or 6 months building that out before you get to this next project. That next project is projected to increase our revenues by $2 to $3 million a month. He was like, so I can pay that fine for the 6 months after this other project is done through 1 month's worth of revenue. And I don't always like that notion of like, well, we're just going to ignore regulation because we have the money for it. But the notion of being able to talk about the urgency of value realization, being able to talk about things like, what is the size of it? What's that level of effort? What's the technical risk of not doing? And then having a secondary calculation. In lean, you think of weightest job, shortest first. That is part of these calculations, and we can bring in other elements as well. And we start looking at what things are we not working on? So we can start to say, okay, look, we look at our portfolio and now the business is shifting, right? Cynthia has given us this mandate of these are the things that we need to be working on. But when we look at our active portfolio, 78% of the items that we're working on are not relevant to those things that our business needs to go move forward to. That's right. Yeah. Reinstein's cost of delay is a great way of thinking about it, although it's a very difficult book to read through for sure. So once we have that notion, we can start saying, okay, do we need to start killing some of these projects that are in flight? And what is the impact if we do that? Now, in addition to this book of work spreadsheet that I've created for them, we can incorporate this into OKRs. We can incorporate this into other roadmaps. What is important about all of this is that when we're talking about this notion of rapid market shifts, or even of not necessarily super rapid market shifts, just of being able to keep up with where the market is going, we need to make sure that these mechanisms we're using are at the appropriate resolution and cadence for the level of feedback and responsiveness we need for our current market condition. So what happened on the other side of this? So with their newfound strategy, Medco was able to take those strategy elements that we had, the mapping that we had as part of it, and this book of work and reorganize their work. And they were able to successfully respond to the market threat. It wasn't all roses. Amazon's launch cut a chunk of customers who wanted the benefits of that platform, as well as their ability to centralize their costs since they were already having to use Amazon in addition to Medco's product. But Medco's compelling vision for competing allowed them to close a pretty sizable funding round, which they invested in building out an upgraded analytics engine capable of sourcing information across providers where they could provide augmented expert advice, and launched a suite of innovative in-home medical assistance devices built on top of smart speakers and sensors that help patients communicate more effectively with their medical providers and make sense of information being reported by the medical provider. So we're not always going to have COVID-19 levels of disruption, but we can count on disruption being something that we have to deal with. So if we start with our purpose and user needs, if we gain situational awareness, if we map those disruptive threats and bring in principles of climate and doctrine, we can formulate informed hypotheses which we can lead and then use that data to continue the loop. So thank you so much. Looks like I'm right on time before the retro. I'm happy to open the floor for questions or comments for the next 5 minutes before the retro experience starts. So